All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. This is our July 2024 ORCID US and ORCID CA community call. So today we'll be talking about ORCID-enabled systems. So before we start, I would like to introduce everyone to our ORCID US community staff members. Of course, we have Sheila Raven, our Senior Strategist for Research Infrastructure Programs. Myself, Paolo Guhilde, your strategist for the ORCID US community, and our colleague Kayla Rumhit is here as well, our program assistant for the ORCID US community. And now we'll pass it on to John to introduce our ORCID CA folks.
Thank you so much, Paolo. So I'm John Aspler, manager of the Canadian Persistent Identifier community, and my colleague Ursula Carmichael is the Canadian Persistent Identifier community officer. Comme d'habitude, nous vous offrons des services bilingues anglais-français. Si vous avez des questions en français, je vous invite de les poser en français dans le chat et je pourrai le traduire. I'm just saying that if folks want to ask questions in French, they're welcome to do so. I'm happy to translate.
Thank you, John. So today, our agenda, so we're going to go through a little bit about what does ORCID integration mean. So basically, we're going to take a look at the API and the functionalities and also some certified service providers. We will also take a look at how the process of turning on the existing ORCID functionality in ORCID-enabled systems. And then we will go through a little bit on the overview of most commonly used ORCID integrated systems, primarily looking at publishing systems, repositories, research information management, and grants management system. And then we will close it out, talking more about what's next. And then, of course, we will have questions and discussions in the end. And with that, I will pass it on to my colleague, Kayla.
Thank you so much, Paolo. Hello, everyone. To get us started today, we're going to talk about what an ORCID integration means and about how that works. So if you could go to the next slide for me, Paolo. Thank you. So ORCID integration, or a technical integration with ORCID, is about configuring organizational systems to allow for ORCID functionality and to make connections between researchers and the organization. There are three types of ORCID integrations. The vendor and open source system integration is an ORCID integration with a system like a grant funding system or repository system, for example, that an organization may already be using or might be thinking of using. Some of these systems may already have built-in ORCID functionality and others may not. The Affiliation Manager, which is a tool made available only to consortium member organizations, accessible in ORCID's member portal, and requires no technical development. This tool, once activated by the organization, allows the organization to write affiliation data, such as employment, education, qualifications, invited positions, distinctions, memberships, or service to a researcher's ORCID record. And finally, the custom integration. A custom integration is really an integration developed to meet the needs of your organization and what your organization wants to accomplish with ORCID. And it can require some additional planning and configuration by a developer on staff to customize the integration for what you need for what you want to do. So for today's call, we're focusing on the vendor and open source system integration and on ORCID-enabled systems. But before we get into that, let's talk a little bit more about how an ORCID integration works. Next slide. So in order to configure an ORCID integration, one ORCID API key is required. So what is an API? An API, or an application programming interface, is the connection between ORCID and a technical system, allowing that system to use and exchange ORCID data. This data could be employment or education data, or information about a researcher's works, or any funding awards that they may have received, as well as other things. So let's dive into a little more detail on how that works. Next slide. Once an integration is activated with an ORCID API key, that system can now access ORCID data. That system can now read data from a researcher's ORCID record and pull it into the system, or it can write data to a researcher's ORCID record and populate that record with information. So for example, an institutional repository, or IR, integrated with ORCID could read data from an affiliated researcher's ORCID record and showcase it in, say, a researcher's profile in the IR, such as the works that researcher has written. Put simply, the ORCID API is the means for allowing that exchange of data between ORCID and your organization. Next slide. So now that we know about the ORCID API and about the types of ORCID integrations, what can I do with an integration? What functionalities does it have? The ORCID API allows for a range of functionality, and different systems may have one or more of these functionalities built in. So once an ORCID integration is activated with an ORCID API key, you can use it to do a few things depending on how your system has been configured to work with the ORCID API. Your researchers can now log in using their ORCID credentials, and this allows an organization to collect authenticated ORCID IDs and become a trusted party in that researcher's ORCID record. Once those authenticated IDs are collected, with certain permissions and scopes enabled, you can read data from those ORCID records and you can write data to ORCID records. You can also use webhooks, which allow organizations to sync ORCID data across multiple systems at your organization. We're going to go into a little more detail about each of these functionalities now. So next slide. So a researcher can sign in with their ORCID credentials to that system. Not only can they connect their ORCID ID with the system, if a researcher does not have an ORCID ID, they can now create one through that system. So I have an example here of how a researcher can log into Proposal Central with their ORCID ID via the Login with ORCID button. And clicking on that will prompt the researcher to enter in their ORCID credentials or create an ORCID account. Next slide. The ORCID API allows organizations to get a researcher's authenticated ORCID ID through an authorization process where the researcher authorizes that organization as a trusted party in their ORCID record. This ensures that you have the correct ORCID ID for each person. As a trusted party, your organization can now interact with the researcher's ORCID record according to the permissions or scopes that have been authorized by the researcher. So a trusted organization can access public data, and if that read limited scope has been used, organizations can access public data and data that can only be read by a trusted organization. If the update scopes have been used, the trusted organization can also write to an ORCID record. So let's go into more detail about reading and writing to ORCID next. Next slide. Organizations can read data from ORCID records and use it with their systems in a variety of ways. By collecting data, such as in the example here with Faculty 180, you can import data directly from a researcher's ORCID record, populating that system with that information at a click of a button rather than manually typing in all that information. This helps the researcher save time during reporting workflows and streamlines those workflows for the organization, reducing administrative burden by reducing errors that might normally occur during manual reporting. Next slide. Organizations can also write data to ORCID records, such as employment or works information, which I mentioned earlier. In the image here, the University of Virginia has written employment information to this ORCID record, and North Carolina University Libraries has written a work to this researcher's record. The green checkmark here denotes that this information came directly from these organizations, making them a trusted source. So in writing data to ORCID records, this improves the accuracy of data in ORCID, asserting the trustworthiness of information and contributing to metadata integrity. Next slide. Lastly, the ORCID API can also allow for syncing data across multiple systems. So using webhooks, systems that have collected authenticated ORCID IDs can be notified when a change has been made to a researcher's ORCID record. These notifications alert the system when data will need to be repulled or read back into the system to pull the new changes. So instead of pulling all the data from all the ORCID records authenticated in a system, using webhook notifications makes it easier to know which ORCID records have been updated and which ones the systems will need to pull from, saving you time. Next slide. So today's call will be focusing on vendor and open source systems that already have one or more of the ORCID API functionalities enabled. ORCID has a list of certified service providers on their website, which lists vendor and open source systems with ORCID integrations that meet ORCID's best practices, as well as meeting specific criteria, such as the ability to write to ORCID records. This slide lists a few of those systems for you as well, and I will also post a link to the chat so that you can access the web page. And so now that you know about what ORCID integrations is, how it works, what you can do with it, the next step is how to get started using it. So I will hand things over to Ursula to talk to you about that.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Kayla. All right, so now that we've reviewed the ORCID member API and its functionality, we'll now take a look at the process for using the 5 API keys that ORCID consortium members can access and turning on existing ORCID functionality. So Kayla mentioned that there are broadly 3 types of ORCID integrations. So custom integrations, affiliation manager, and the vendor or open source system integrations. I will be focusing on reviewing the process for turning on the vendor or open source system integrations, particularly those that are included in ORCID's certified service provider list. So unlike custom integrations, this process does not involve any development or demos on the institutional side or any sandbox testing. It's really just a process of configuring an application. I'll also be mentioning a few resources and different types of ORCID documentation today, and I'll be putting them in the chat once I'm done speaking. Next slide, please, Paolo. So before we run through the step-by-step process of turning on existing ORCID functionality, I just want to take a moment to highlight the first step on the slide here, which is integration planning or identifying system of interest, which strategically is probably the most important step. So one of the first things to think about once you become an ORCID CA or ORCID US member is to carefully consider or strategize which integrations would be the most useful or the most impactful for your institution. Another way to think about it is to understand how your institution or organization can use the 5 API keys to get the most out of an ORCID consortium membership. To that end, at the outset, it's critical to think about effective communication and uptake strategies to ensure that the benefits of the integration are actually being implemented at your institution. So some questions to think about might include, what do you want to do with the ORCID API? Or does the system in question support ORCID? During this strategy stage, as a helpful starting point in selecting which systems you want to integrate, you can consult the ORCID certified service provider listing that Kayla mentioned. If the system is included on the list, it means that it has been tested and meets ORCID's requirements and best practices. So member organizations can use ORCID production API keys right away, rather than spending time testing the integration in ORCID sandbox environment. Active communication with various institutional or organizational stakeholders during this initial strategy process for input and buy-in is also strongly encouraged. Depending on the local context and eventually the system being considered, this could involve consulting with the library, the IT department, researchers or faculty, HR, among others. If the main contact for the institution's ORCID consortium membership is not already involved in this process, they will need to be contacted and included at this early stage, as they are the primary liaison between the institution and consortium staff. In addition, main contacts generally have the ability to grant access to other individuals who might need access to the member portal during this process. And of course, the member portal provides helpful metrics for tracking the activity of your integration once turned on and in use, which would be helpful for all involved to have access to. Next slide, please. So once a system has been chosen and an engagement or uptake strategy has been outlined, the next step is to fill out the form entitled Register a Client Application or Production Member API. The slides will be shared after this call, and you can access the form pictured on the slide by following the hyperlink, and I'll also put the link in the chat. Next slide, please. So once a form has been submitted to ORCID, staff at ORCID Support will get back to you shortly with your client ID and client secret via email. The client ID and client secret, which effectively act as a username and password, respectively, for the application, can then be plugged into the system configuration to turn on or activate the integration. At this point, your institution system should be integrated with ORCID, and you'll be actively using one of the 5 API keys. And at this point, you can let your researchers and any other relevant institutional stakeholders know that the integration is active. For example, if your institution organization has chosen to turn on OJS, you can let researchers and staff know that you will be requesting permission to update ORCID records with published article information. Next slide, please. And finally, last but certainly not least, you can begin implementing the outreach strategy within your organization or institution to support awareness and engagement with the newly activated ORCID integration. ORCID actually has a whole library of resources dedicated to outreach support. And ORCID also provides a guide outlining strategies and documentation to successfully support or think about the adoption and implementation of newly activated integrations. Now I'll pass it over to John to discuss some of the most commonly used ORCID integrated systems in the US and Canada.
Thank you so much, Ursula. So we're going to dig into those systems now, which means that we're going to be going fairly quickly over a whole bunch of different kinds of systems in a variety of categories of systems. So we won't be going into a huge amount of depth, and this isn't even necessarily a comprehensive list. These are 17 integrations that are very common in Canada, or 17 systems that are common in Canada that have ORCID integrations in them. But if you have other systems, we'll certainly talk about where you can find more information out about that. Next slide, please. So, as Kayla already mentioned, or as Paolo already mentioned in the overview, there are 4 categories of systems we're going to be talking about: publishing systems, repositories, research information management systems, RIM systems, and grant management or application systems. So, I'll be focusing specifically on publishing systems, and for each of these, we're going to highlight an ideal workflow. What do you want any given publishing system or any given repository to be doing with ORCID? They will all start in the same way, and it's that we want the author or the user to be connecting their ORCID ID to this particular system through a formal authentication process. This means no one is copying and pasting their ORCID ID into some sort of empty text box or field. They are clicking on a button, logging into their ORCID record, and the ORCID ID is being transmitted back automatically to that publication platform, to that system via the ORCID API. This process, like Kayla highlighted, also usually involves an authorization process where you are granting certain permissions to a given system. And we'll be talking about how each of these different kinds of system, like in a publishing workflow, what that actually looks like when the permissions are ultimately used. Another thing to keep in mind with a publishing system and an ideal workflow is that you usually only have one person who is creating a profile on a given publishing platform to submit an article. It may be the first author, it may be a research assistant, and none of the authors involved. So we also need some sort of workflow to enable all co-authors to connect their ORCID ID back to this article for when it's ultimately going to be published. So this is usually done with an email workflow. So an email is sent out at some point during the submission process to co-authors to enable them to click a button, connect, authenticate, authorize permissions as someone would directly on the platform. So once that's done, once we have folks authenticating their ORCID IDs, the next thing that we would typically want is for the ORCID ID to be displayed in a few different places. If someone is actively logging into a platform and there is an author profile page, we would like to have the ORCID ID prominently displayed on that author profile page. Another place where ultimately we want to display it is once the article is successfully published, that article, or I shouldn't just say article, that work page and its item metadata should include the ORCID ID somewhere on the page. Another item that we typically want as part of this workflow is the ability to read information from ORCID. Kayla mentioned the read limited scope. That might be useful here, but even just some of the general information an author might have listed publicly can help reduce the administrative burden of doing this kind of work. For example, if I am in the middle of submitting an article and I need to add my affiliation, it would be ideal if I didn't have to type it out yet again, if I could just have it sent to my profile or sent to the submission form via ORCID. And then finally, once the article is successfully published, what we want to see is for the work metadata to be added to the ORCID record of the scholar without them having to do anything. That's the point of the authorization. They shouldn't have to add the work to their ORCID record themselves. Ideally, this information would get pushed back into their ORCID record for them by the system that they've authorized to do so. And when we're talking about works or publishing platforms, there is one other really important element to this, and this is granting credit to peer reviewers. So it's not just about getting the article's metadata flowing around the research ecosystem, it's also about adding peer review information to ORCID. This is something that can't be done manually. It has to happen from an external system, adding it on your behalf to your ORCID record. And of course, the kind of metadata you want is nowhere near as specific or as precise as an article or a publication, because you usually don't want to identify the title of the article. It's a blinded process. So what we want to do is have some sort of information that says this person absolutely reviewed an article for this journal at some point in this year, and leave it maybe not more specific than that, but enough to enable the credit being granted formally for an activity that's not always necessarily recognized meaningfully in this kind of an academic process. Next slide, please. So the 3 systems I'm going to highlight here are Open Journal System, OJS, which also has a sister system, Open Preprint System, OPS, that have basically the same integration, Editorial Manager from Elsevier, and Scholar One from Clarivate. Both OJS and Editorial Manager have a certified integration. They are certified service providers. Scholar One and Clarivate is not. Even so, Out of the box, you can typically just follow the process that Ursula highlighted, which is just applying and automatically getting the API credentials. And that's mostly because Scholar One is not a particularly does not have a particularly advanced integration, and I'll highlight what that means. All three of these have the sign in with ORCID functionality that Kayla highlighted. So you can just log into any of these platforms with your ORCID credentials once you've connected your ORCID ID to that account. And all of them, of course, fundamentally have to enable authentication. That is core to any member integration. That is core to the work that's being done here. There is no way to have a system like this have a meaningful ORCID integration without an authentication process. And ideally, of course, you are also authorizing those higher level permissions to modify Scholar's ORCID record. In the case of read data, only OJS collects information, and I wouldn't say it's a huge amount. I believe it's just if you are connecting during the registration process, it collects your name, maybe one or two other small pieces of information into the registration form. It still helps reduce some of the administrative burden, but in contrast, Editorial Manager and Scholar One don't collect anything at all. There's always more that could be collected, though. When it comes to writing, OJS is writing both works and peer review metadata to ORCID. Editorial Manager is writing peer review, and Scholar One is writing nothing to ORCID records. And none of these integrations use webhooks. So I'll end this section here before passing it over to Sheila, but I do just want to add, and something we'll dive into a little bit later in the presentation, is that as you can see here, not all integrations are built the same. OJS is an open infrastructure tool, and it's a PKP, public knowledge project, which manages OJS. We work very closely with them, and we have an ORCID OJS working group. We've been working together for years to advance as a community the ORCID integration, and that's why it has so many of these amazing functionalities. When it comes to vendor systems, you're kind of at the mercy of whatever it is that the vendor is going to enable you to do. So if this particular vendor has only enabled a certain functionality, that's going to require some advocacy or some client engagement to try and enhance or add more features to the integration. So we'll come back to that later, and I'll pass it over to Sheila to discuss repositories.
Great. So yes, now looking at repositories, the ideal workflow here is very similar to the publishing ideal workflow. You're seeing that, again, we're dealing with submissions here. So depending on who is submitting the work to the repository, it might be the author. It might be somebody who was not involved in creating the work at all. So there could be some variance here depending on what your submission workflow is for your repository. But ideally, the author, if they're the one submitting, they would authenticate their ORCID ID upon submission. If they have co-authors or if the author is not the person submitting the work, ideally there would be an email workflow where you would have the email address for all of the people involved in the work. An email would go out to them containing an ORCID authorization link that would allow them to authenticate their ORCID ID for the work in the repository. Once you have the authenticated ORCID IDs for the authors of the works in your repository, ideally, those ORCID IDs would be displayed along with the work on the landing pages, for example, next to the author names. Ideally, those works would then also get written to the author's ORCID records. And another kind of side note here, because many repositories and publishing systems too, for that matter, have DOIs assigned to the works. So that's another consideration if you are assigning DOIs to works in your repository. Ideally, the ORCID IDs for the authors would be included in your DOI metadata. And if those authors have granted permission to Crossref or DataCite to connect with their ORCID record, those DOIs could get automatically added to the work section of ORCID. So let's go to the next slide and look at some specific repository systems that we're highlighting today, because these are ones that either have an ORCID integration or an ORCID integration is possible. Out of the ones you're seeing here, right now, Ex Libris Esploro is the only one that is a certified service provider with ORCID.
DSpace is a little more complicated. DSpace 7.3 introduced the actual ORCID member API integration where users can authenticate their ORCID ID with their profile in DSpace. However, so it was certified at that time by ORCID, but ORCID kind of made some changes to the certification requirements. And so DSpace needs to recertify essentially. And if you are using DSpace, just know that Lyrasis is working with Science right now to do some bug fixes and enhancements related to ORCID in DSpace, basically 7.6 and up. And so that work is currently taking place right now. If you're not already on my email list and you are using DSpace and want to be involved in getting updates about that, send me a chat, or just put something in the chat. You can send it directly to me or not with your email address, and I'll add you to the list. That said, DSpace and Dataverse, as well as Islandora, have the ability to sign in using ORCID. Of course, that's a configuration that you could turn on or off, but the ability to do that is there. All of these systems do have the ability to collect those authenticated ORCID IDs from researchers. And then in terms of reading data from ORCID, right now, Esploro and DSpace do have the ability to pull works information from somebody's ORCID record into the system to display on that person's profile, for example. Writing data to ORCID, again, Esploro and DSpace have that ability to send data from the repository system to the person's ORCID record, as long as that person has connected their ORCID ID. And then with the webhooks and the syncing, none of them have that built in already. It is possible to enable that. So especially to note with the open source systems like DSpace and Islandora, there may or may not be things built in, but because they're open source, you can always do customizations with your own local instance if you want to. So that would be possible if that's something that you wanted to do. Okay, so on the next slide, we are looking at research information management. And so we're kind of putting repositories and RIM systems together because there's starting to be a little bit of a gray area. Some systems you would say are a repository, but they might also be doubling as a research information management system and vice versa. So we categorize them in general, but if you might be using some of these systems for different things. Same basic thing. In a research information management system, typically researchers have some sort of profile, and ideally they would be able to connect their authenticated ORCID ID to their profile. That researcher's ORCID ID would be displayed on their profile page. And in order to populate the profile and the information, ideally, any data from the ORCID record could be pulled in to populate somebody's profile, or if they're doing like their annual report or whatever. And same thing, any information that's already in the RIM system could ideally be sent to the person's ORCID record. So having that really robust flow of information between the person's ORCID record and their research information management profile. Okay, so now we're going to look at some of the specific systems. And I actually have 2 slides for this because there are a lot of them. So first up, we're looking at symplectic elements, InfoEd, and DSpace Chris. These are all certified service providers with ORCID. A big criteria for being a certified service provider is that the integration writes data to ORCID. That's one of the kind of main things that would get your integration certified. So these are all certified. They all allow for connecting the ORCID IDs with the profiles. They all pull data in from ORCID to some extent. Mostly it's works. And they all write data to ORCID. And you can see that they all kind of are slightly different in the type of data that they can push to ORCID, but we're seeing employment, education. With symplectic elements, they can write works to ORCID. With InfoEd, it can write funding to ORCID. And with DSpace Chris, you can see that it also has qualifications there. Symplectic elements and DSpace Chris also have the webhooks turned on. So these systems would get a notification anytime something had been changed on somebody's ORCID record, and then would automatically re-pull that data so that it's always up to date. Looking at the next slide, we have a few more RIM systems to look at. These are not certified by ORCID, but they do have integrations available to some extent or another. So with Pure, people can sign in using ORCID. They can connect their ORCID ID to their Pure profile. Pure can pull works from ORCID in to help populate the profile, and it can also write employment and works to the person's ORCID record, and it's also got that webhooks syncing mechanism in place. Faculty 180, right now, people can connect their ORCID ID, and then it just pulls in data from ORCID. It does not push data to ORCID. But pulling in data from ORCID can help researchers save time when they go to populate their Faculty 180 profile or their report, for example. And then we've got the watermark faculty success, formerly digital measures. This one currently is similar. It only pulls publications in from ORCID. We have received intel that they are working on pushing works to ORCID, for example. So that's a great next step for anyone that's using faculty success. And so we're just kind of waiting and looking out for that functionality to become available. And then Vivo, which is an open source system, does have the ability, if you are using Vivo, your researchers can connect their ORCID ID to their Vivo profile, and it will write their Vivo ID to the ORCID record. I know the volunteers that are, working on Vivo would like to add more functionality for ORCID, and so hopefully it's just a matter of time before we see that too. So with that, I'll hand it back to Paolo to take us through the grant funding systems.
Okay. Thank you, Sheila. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the grant funding systems. So grant funding systems are typically the ones that you would use to apply for grants, for example. So if you want to, say, apply to get funding from American Heart Association or American Cancer Society, typically you'll be able to use a grant funding system to do all of those applications. So the typical workflow, so the ideal workflow is very much similar to the other systems as well. One of the things that we always emphasize, for example, is that when you are, say, submitting something for an application or looking at systems, whether they are connected with ORCID or not, is to look for that green ORCID ID icon. So that's kind of your indicator that that there's some ORCID functionalities available in that system. So in this case, a researcher or a faculty or anyone else that's applying or for a grant would connect to a grant funding system, and then the workflow would then take them to eventually to have their ORCID ID displayed in the researcher's profile page. Also, if they get awards, for example, so if they received funding from one of the funding agencies, typically, ideally, you would want the funding award to be written to ORCID records. So in the funding section, you would have your funding information available there. So it would be like this researcher received this funding from this organization. And also a big part of this is to be able to grab data from ORCID to fill out those applications. So it makes it easier and makes it it streamlines a lot of the processes from the researcher. So to be able to grab data from ORCID to fill out, say, an application for a grant award. So that's really sort of like your ideal workflow here. And then we're going to take a look at some of examples here as well. So we're going to highlight about 3 grant funding systems, which are Proposal Central, Smart Simple, and Simplistic Grant Tracker. Now, we've talked a lot about certified service providers, and one of the things that really I kind of shared on the chat, and I want to mention it here, is that the things that we're looking at today is that some of these systems are certified under the updated ORCID certified service provider kind of criteria. So there are systems previously that were certified, however, at this time they're not certified yet in the new criteria. So for this one, for example, so we have Proposal Central, which is a certified service provider. The other 2 systems that we're looking at, currently they are not certified by ORCID. Proposal Central, you're able to log in using or sign in using your ORCID ID. Unfortunately, the other 2, that's not possible at this time. And of course, all 3 systems is you're able to collect authenticated ORCID ID. And I want to iterate what John mentioned earlier, that that's really a big, an important aspect of an ORCID integration is to be able to get that authenticated ORCID ID. And so all 3 of these systems are able to do that. As far as reading data from ORCID, Proposal Central is pretty much able to read all the data from ORCID. So it could be your publications, your education, your employment, public funding information. So your Proposal Central is able to grab that data and populate whatever's available, what needs to be done in the system for applications, for example, or for reporting, all of those things. Smart Simple, you're able to also read data, but you're able to read funding and works only at this time. Grant Tracker, you're also able to read works. Now, writing data, which is really important when it comes to, say, making sure that you have authoritative authoritative data in your ORCID record. So with Proposal Central, the system is able to push funding information to ORCID. So we kind of mentioned that already, to be able to have the funding awards available in your ORCID record. The other thing that Proposal Central is able to do is to push peer review activity. So providing or giving credit to the researchers and to anyone who reviewed grant applications. And that's really important, to be able to provide credit to people that are either volunteering or providing service to your organization. With Smart Simple, you're able to push funding information. Again, that's a big kind of important thing, to have funding information in your ORCID record as well. And that's the same thing with Grant Tracker, is to have that. All of this information is really important when it comes to, say, the future of other applications that you're going to do for grants, for example. So that's really, to have all of this data available in your ORCID record will make it easier to apply for future grants, makes it easier for you to perhaps even think about research and security compliance, to have all of this information. And as far as webhook syncing, you can enable that in Proposal Central as well. So you'll be able to have the system to be able to identify which has been updated, and an ORCID record that's been updated, to be able to grab that information. At this time, Smart Simple and Grant Tracker are not able to do that. So all of this information is really key, the different functionalities of ORCID, and what are the things that each system can do when it comes to enabling an ORCID functionality within the integration. And that really kind of brings us towards the end of what we're talking today before we go into the discussion, is that there's always room for improvement. So you see those different functionalities that we've talked about, to be able to sign in to ORCID, to be able to collect authenticated ID, to read data from ORCID, to push data to ORCID, and to have webhooks enabled. All of those functionalities, probably not one system is able to complete all of those. However, there's always room for improvement. So one of the things that we always encourage everyone to do, especially from organizations like you, is to contact the vendors that you're working with, the companies that you're getting the systems from, or to advocate for yourself, to really make sure that they can add functionalities, for example, to the systems that you're using. So you could always reach out to a vendor, for example, and say, hey, we really want to be able to push data to ORCID. So go ahead and reach out to them and just voice just advocate for yourself as an organization to be able to add ORCID functionality in the systems that you're using. And with that also, which brings us to another things that we're working on. So here at the ORCID US community, and we're actually also sharing this now with ORCID CA, and hopefully sharing it with the rest of the world, is that we have created a new way for us to kind of show the common systems for ORCID integration. So we used to have this on our website on the ORCID US community, but now we're moving it to a Trello board to make it easier for everyone to be able to share information. So for example, John and Ursula are able to get in here and say, add a system that may be common in Canada, or perhaps update a system that's listed here of information that they've heard from the vendor that we are not familiar yet here in the US. So this is really a way for us to kind of share the information, and for you all, for all of our members and future members, to be able to look at a system and see what the functionalities are of a particular common system that you're using. So if you say looking at digital measures of faculty success, you can go in here and see what the system is, what the different functionalities are available to it, whether they're ORCID certified provider or not, and also be able to look at some of the comments that we've entered. Sheila kind of mentioned that faculty success is basically planning to be able to start writing to ORCID. And we have put that information here as well in the comment section of the Trello for this particular Trello card for faculty success. So you can take a look at what the progress is for these systems. You can also go in here and see, say, for example, if you want to advocate, you want to reach out to the vendor and say like, hey, we really want you to add other additional functionalities to the system that we're using. We do have an email template that's also linked here in this Trello board or Trello card that you can use to modify, to adapt, to reach out to your vendors and to your representatives that you're working with. So there's really improvement that can be done as far as ways that each ORCID-enabled system can, to add ORCID functionalities to their system. So we're definitely looking forward to have more integrations from different systems with ORCID. And with that, we are going to go to our questions and discussions. So we're going to open it up to everyone, and we'll have a good conversation. All right. Let's see.
Questions in the chat. We're happy to take questions out loud.
People can also unmute and turn on your video too if you want it, if you prefer to do that.
Maybe I'll jump to, there was one question in the chat. You may see that I've given an extraordinarily long answer, at least for Zoom text. it was really sort of about the way that things like DataCite, Dataverse interact with ORCID and sort of where some of these challenges are. Like we were highlighting with vendor integrations, every system itself that is managed by a particular entity or community, that's where the responsibility lies to manage the ORCID integration. Of course, we all work together, we all support each other. There's no doubt about that. I mentioned earlier the ORCID OJS working group. That's something that involves ORCID and PKP and the ORCID US and ORCID CA communities, among others. So there are lots of opportunities for those kinds of collaborations. But all that to say, really at the heart of this particular question is that Dataverse itself has no meaningful integration with ORCID. I believe it just has a text box where you can copy paste an ORCID ID. That already is a non-starter for a meaningful integration, for a member API integration, because there's no ability to actually authenticate and authorize permissions. So it's not Dataverse that's really interacting with your system. It's ultimate, or that's interacting with your ORCID ID. It's DataCite. But it also has a lot to do not just with how DataCite pushes metadata into ORCID, it also has a lot to do with how Dataverse collects that information and registers DOIs via DataCite. So there's some complexity here. I don't know that I have the specific answer to that question, but I did want to highlight that some of these things interact in really fun and confusing and interesting ways. Chris.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks for the great webinar as always. That was really interesting. I just wanted to, for those of you who don't know me, I'm with ORCID. I'm the executive director. I just wanted to comment on, I think, Paolo, you mentioned this idea of sending an email to vendors where, we'd like them to improve the ORCID integration. What we would strongly recommend now that we have revamped the Certified Service Provider program is that the way you do this is by asking the vendor, or indeed making it a term of your procurement if you're buying or renewing a new system, that they actually become a CSP. Obviously, we are trying to work with most of these vendors to get them to improve their integrations. But they all have huge backlogs of features they're trying to improve, right? The thing that will make them take notice is if they're hearing from their customers and their potential customers that you want them to improve that functionality. And we think the strongest way you can do that is by, if you're putting an RFP out, for example, actually making it one of the criteria of the RFP that the system has to be an ORCID certified system, because that will most likely, hopefully, and having formerly worked for a vendor, likely to encourage them to get that work done.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Chris. So we're actually also in the process of updating our email template. So we will definitely add that information there as well. So that way our members are able to take a look at that and use it. So to have more of like information about the ORCID certified service provider would be helpful.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chris. And thanks, Paolo. Sorry, go ahead, Chris. I see you wanted to add something.
No, I was just going to say thanks to Paolo for the reply.
I'll add, one of the roles that we as consortium leads can play is in facilitating community groups or groups of members to do this kind of engagement. We know in the Canadian context, I'm sure Paolo, Sheila, and Kayla know in the American context, roughly, which members are using which systems. And sometimes when we see, for example, Scholar One does not have the integration we wanted to have, even though some of our members have Scholar One and have considered turning on the ORCID integration, without the functionality there to write to ORCID records, that's one integration that unfortunately many have chosen not to use. And knowing the members we have that do that, in the US knowing members that have that, we can provide not just the email templates, which is all the work of the US community, but we can group together everyone to work on a campaign or to have a client group that sort of engages directly with the vendor to say, we'd really love this. And of course, as Chris said, if you're doing procurement, well, this is pre being a client and making the CSP certification a requirement is helpful.
Franny, I saw your hand up if you want to.
Oh, I just wanted to say thank you very much for kind of sharing the information about like what goes into making somebody a certified provider and that it's like writing to ORCID records. I think that was just kind of helpful information. And we're also working on our first integration right now. And so just kind of seeing behind the scenes and also kind of like understanding what this looks like ideally and kind of what it might end up looking like not so ideally, I think was just really helpful as we're preparing to embark on this for the first time. So just this was both very timely and super interesting. So yeah, thank you for that.
Awesome. Thanks, Franny.
Seeing some interest in the chat around those templates. That makes a lot of sense. For those of you who are ORCID CA members, we have very, very old versions of the templates that Lyris has provided to us, probably in 2019 or something. So we do not have up-to-date ones, but we do have those templates, and they're available to you in the ORCID CA member materials drive. I am sure that we will be engaging with Lyris to understand what their updates are and to see how we can adapt those to our particular Canadian systems.
Yeah, along those lines, I will say in the past, we have had some community members kind of share with us an email that they sent to their vendor, and that can be really helpful too. So our templates are there just to save you time if you don't feel like writing up your own email. But if you have a specific system that you're using and you have specific reasons why you want more ORCID integration and you're writing an email to your vendor, feel free to share that with us too, because there are probably other people in similar situations. And so that's one of the benefits of having our consortia approach, is that we can work together and kind of share those kinds of things. Yeah, Brian, go ahead.
Brian.
Hi, everyone. That was a great presentation. Thanks very much. I just wanted to share, and I put it in the notes of the additional API scope that is the summary. So you guys did an excellent job of mentioning the API capabilities, but there is, very, very recently the capability for systems to say have a specific ORCID record. So John, you could just kind of do an API call to your record and then put in a summary. And even without the API, you can have a look of what that looks like, of all the different features from, trusted parties throughout the research ecosphere, grant management systems, repositories, etc. So yeah, just wanted to add that, and it's in the notes for our folks. Yeah.
Thanks, Brian. That's thanks for bringing that to our attention. That's awesome. Any other questions in the chat out loud? I know we dove into 17 different unique systems across 4 categories. There are other categories. ORCID recently added discovery systems to their list of certification criteria, because each system, of course, each kind of system has its own set of workflows, which is what we were trying to highlight. So, if you have any follow-up questions about a particular system you're using, you're looking for it on the Trello, you want to know more about turning it on, we certainly encourage that. In Canada, we know that most of you are using OJS. Those of you who have not turned on the integration, let's make that happen. Contact us. It's an easy configuration. As Sheila highlighted, DSpace is another commonly used system. We're working on some stuff around that. Hopefully we'll have more for you soon. There's just that everyone's using a bajillion different systems, and so your needs will always be unique, and we're here to help with that.
All right, looks like okay, so it looks like we don't have any more questions. Just want to iterate what Chan said to please contact us. We have our contact information available on the chat. You can also, when we share the email, the slide deck and the recording, you have that information there as well. All right, well, thank you, everyone. We'll see you soon.
Thank you all. Bye. Awesome.